The train slowed long before it reached Harlan's Crossing. Evelyn Carter felt it in her bones before she looked out the window. That gradual, reluctant drag of iron wheels on iron rails, as though even the locomotive was losing its nerve. She pressed her fingers flat against the glass and watched the landscape shift from the pale scrubland she'd been staring at for 2 days into something that actually looked like it had been shaped by human hands. Fences. Long stretches of split-rail fencing running parallel to the tracks, then turning away into a distance so flat and brown it hurt to look at. A water tower with the name of the town painted on it in letters that had started flaking. A grain silo. Then the first buildings. Low, practical, weather-worn. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It wasn't much of a town. That was her first honest thought, and she let herself have it without guilt. She'd grown up in Harrisburg, where buildings stood 3 stories tall and the streets were noisy from morning until midnight, where you could buy a newspaper on any corner and smell someone's supper cooking from a block away. Harlan's Crossing was nothing like that. It was a single main street, maybe 6 or 7 storefronts on each side, a livery stable at the far end, and what looked like a church with a crooked weather vane. Dust on everything. Her second thought, arriving almost immediately after the first, was that none of that mattered. She was 34 years old. She had a carpet bag and a leather trunk and a small drawstring purse with $42 in it. What remained after the train tickets and the meal she'd bought herself in Denver because she couldn't stand the thought of arriving starving. She had a letter folded inside her coat pocket, creased from being read and refolded too many times, containing the name and address of one Caleb Walker, cattle baron, and the terms of an arrangement she had agreed to through correspondence that stretched across 3 months and 17 letters. The train lurched to a full stop. Evelyn stood, straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. The platform was windy, the kind of wind that came from nowhere in particular and went nowhere specific, just pushed at whatever was in its way. It knocked a loose strand of hair across her face the moment she stepped down, and she pulled it back with one hand while trying to hold her bag with the other and not lose her footing on the wooden steps. Graceful, she was not. She managed. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform, a few waiting for mail or freight, a couple saying goodbye to someone on the train, an old man sitting on a bench with no apparent purpose except to watch, and off to the side, standing near the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, a man who was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who had agreed to something and was now having second thoughts about it. She knew it was him before he said a word. Not because she'd been given a photograph, she hadn't, but because of the way he stood. Like a man who was used to being looked at. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere north of 40, wearing a coat that had probably cost more than anything in her trunk combined. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set against bad news so many times it had simply stayed that way. Caleb Walker. He crossed to her when she made eye contact. She gave him credit for that. He didn't make her come to him. "Mrs. Carter," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Walker." She offered her hand and he shook it. His grip was brief, businesslike, the kind of handshake that was meant to convey nothing personal. "You made good time," he said. The train was only a few hours delayed out of Cheyenne, nothing remarkable. He nodded once, like he was filing that away. He looked at her carpet bag and then at the platform behind her. "Is that all you brought?" "There's a trunk in the freight car. I'll have one of the men get it." He turned and said something to a younger man standing a few paces back, barely more than a boy, maybe 17, wearing a hat 2 sizes too big, and the boy moved off without a word. Then Caleb Walker turned back to Evelyn and seemed to run out of things to say almost immediately. She was used to silence. She didn't try to fill it. "The wagon's on the street," he said finally. "It's about 40 minutes to the estate." "That's fine." He led and she followed, and she was aware of the eyes following them both down the platform. The old man on the bench had shifted to watch them go. A woman in a gray dress standing near the station door leaned slightly to say something to the woman beside her. Evelyn didn't look at them directly. She'd gotten good at that. Knowing she was being observed without giving anyone the satisfaction of catching her reaction to it. The wagon was a good one. Heavy, well-maintained, pulled by 2 horses that stood with the calm patience of animals that had been worked well and fed regularly. Caleb helped her up without being asked, which she appreciated, and then went around to take the reins himself. The boy with the oversized hat appeared a few minutes later with her trunk, and he and another man lashed it to the back. They drove out of town without ceremony. For a while, nobody said anything. The town fell behind them, and the road turned into something less defined. Still a road, still marked by wheel ruts and compacted earth, but increasingly surrounded by rangeland that stretched in every direction without apparent limit. Grass and sage, and the occasional stand of cottonwood along a dry creek bed. 7 children, Evelyn said eventually. Caleb glanced at her sideways. Yes. Your letter said the youngest is 6. Noah, he'll be 7 in the spring. And the eldest? Margaret, she's 19. She keeps the house. A pause. Has kept the house. For the past 4 years. Evelyn understood what that meant without being told. She didn't push. And the others? She asked. He told her in the abbreviated way of a man who gave necessary information without embellishment. Thomas, 17. The twins, Daniel and Ruth, 15. Clara, 12. Henry, 9. Noah, 6. He gave her their names and their ages and approximately nothing else, and she listened and stored it away. What do they know about me? She asked. Another sideways glance, longer this time. That you're coming, that I wrote to several women and chose you. He paused. That it's a business arrangement. She kept her expression neutral. And how did they take that? Differently, he said. Which was not an answer, but was probably the most honest one he could give. She looked out at the land rolling past. A hawk was riding the thermals somewhere above the grass to the east, circling without apparent effort or hurry. I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Walker, she said. I'm not here under any illusions. I understand what this is. I appreciate that. But I should tell you, I intend to be useful. That's not a performance. I'm not going to spend my time decorating your parlor and staying out of the way. If I'm going to be in your house, I'm going to be in it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't advertise for a decorative woman. No, she said. You didn't. I read your letters carefully. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but something less closed than what had been there before. He turned his attention back to the horses. They rode in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less like 2 strangers with nothing to say, more like 2 people who had said what needed saying and were allowing it to settle. The road crested a low rise, and there it was. She'd known it would be large. His letters hadn't hidden that. But knowing and seeing are different things, and Evelyn felt something catch in her chest when Walker Estate spread itself out before her. The main house was 2 stories, white-painted, with a deep porch running along the front, and what looked like a separate wing extending off one side. Behind it and to the left was a large barn, red with white trim, and beyond that more structures, outbuildings, a bunkhouse, grain storage, things she couldn't immediately identify. Corrals with cattle, more fence lines stretching into the distance. Several men were visible working near the barn. A windmill turned slowly above a water tank. It was prosperous, genuinely, substantially prosperous. The kind of place that had taken generations of hard work, or a great deal of ruthlessness, or both. It's a working ranch, Caleb said, as though he felt the need to explain it. I can see that. 216 ranch hands at peak season, reduced in winter, 48,000 acres. She didn't say anything. She was still taking it in. The house needs attention, he added, and there was something in his voice when he said it that she couldn't quite place. Not quite embarrassment. Closer to grief, actually. Things have gotten away from us since Eleanor passed. Eleanor. His wife's name appearing for the first time in their entire exchange. She filed that away too. How long ago? She asked quietly. 4 years? I'm sorry. He didn't respond to that. He flicked the reins and guided the horses down the lane toward the house, and they didn't speak again until they'd pulled to a stop in front of the porch. There were children on the porch. Not all of them. 3 of them. A girl of about 12 standing with her arms crossed and her chin at a particular angle that Evelyn recognized from long experience as the posture of a person who has already made up their mind. A boy of perhaps 9 or 10 sitting on the porch steps, looking down at the ground with the exaggerated casualness of someone pretending not to be watching. And behind the screen door, barely visible, a small face peering out. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon, aware of every eye on her. The girl with the crossed arms looked her up and down with a frankness that would have been rude in most company. Evelyn met her gaze without flinching and didn't look away first. "Clara," Caleb said from behind her. "Come say hello." Clara did not uncross her arms. "Hello," she said. It was the most minimal compliance with a direct instruction that Evelyn had ever witnessed. "Hello, Clara," Evelyn said. "It's good to meet you." The boy on the steps looked up briefly. He had his father's jaw already, growing into it. "I'm Henry." "Henry. Thank you for telling me." The small face behind the screen door had retreated. Caleb was at her side now. "Margaret and the others are inside," he said. "We'll do proper introductions at supper." She nodded, picked up her carpet bag, and followed him up the porch steps and through the door. The house stopped her. Not because it was bad. It wasn't. The bones of it were extraordinary. The entry hall had hardwood floors and 12-foot ceilings and a staircase with carved newel posts that had probably cost a fortune. Light came through tall windows on either side of the door. There was a grandfather clock against the far wall, ticking steadily. But the floors hadn't been waxed in a very long time. The windows were clouded with dust at the corners. There were muddy boot tracks near the door that had been there long enough to dry and crack. A coat rack to her left held approximately 14 coats and hats in a heap that had gone past organized into something between a pile and an avalanche. One of the curtains on the left window was hanging crookedly, its rod tilted at an angle. On the hall table, beneath the clock, there was a stack of papers, a broken harness buckle, a child's wooden toy horse, 3 loose buttons, and an empty coffee cup. She took all of this in about 4 seconds and showed none of it on her face. "I'll have someone take your trunk to the room," Caleb said. "Thank you. Supper is at 6. I'll have Margaret show you around." He paused. "If you need anything before then, I'll manage." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, replaced his hat, and went back outside. She stood alone in the entry hall, listening to the clock tick and the sound of the wind outside, and somewhere above her, footsteps moving across the floor with the particular rhythm of someone trying to walk quietly and not quite succeeding. Margaret Walker came downstairs at 10 minutes past 3, and she did it the way some people enter rooms, as though she expected to be the most important person in it and was prepared to enforce that if necessary. She was 19, tall like her father, with dark hair pinned up in a style that was practical rather than fashionable, and brown eyes that assessed rather than simply observed. She was wearing an apron over a plain dress, and her hands showed the work she'd been doing, rough at the knuckles, a faint stain of something near the right wrist. She stopped at the bottom of the staircase and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was carefully controlled to reveal very little. "Mrs. Carter," she said. "Margaret." Evelyn had put down her carpet bag and was standing in the middle of the hall. She'd deliberately not moved anything, not touched anything, not tried to make herself comfortable in a way that would signal ownership. "Your father said you might show me around." "Did he?" Not a question. A notation. "He did," Evelyn said, keeping her voice easy. "But only if it's convenient. I don't want to pull you from anything important." Something flickered across the girl's face. Not warmth, but something marginally more complicated than pure hostility. She untied her apron and draped it over the newel post. "Follow me," she said. The tour was thorough and completely impersonal. Margaret moved from room to room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had memorized a list rather than a home. The parlor, large, well-furnished, currently somewhat cluttered with mending and books, and what appeared to be a saddle in the process of being repaired. The dining room, a table long enough to seat 12, currently stacked at one end with a collection of objects that seemed to have accumulated there through entropy rather than intention. The kitchen, large, functional, significantly warmer than the rest of the house, with a wood stove that was clearly the center of domestic activity. "I do most of the cooking," Margaret said in the kitchen. "Mrs. Pruitt comes twice a week to help with laundry and heavy cleaning, but the daily meals are mine." "You've been managing all of this since you were 15?" Evelyn asked. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. Somebody had to. "I wasn't criticizing, I was acknowledging it. That's a significant amount of work for a young woman." The girl looked at her for a moment. "The pantry is through there," she said, and continued the tour. The bedrooms were on the second floor. Evelyn's room was at the end of the hall, separated from the family rooms by a short passage. It was clean, not particularly welcoming, bare walls, a bed with a plain quilt, a washstand, a wardrobe, but clean. Someone had made the effort. Whether that was Margaret's doing or someone else's, Evelyn didn't know. "This was a guest room," Margaret said. "Before." "It's more than adequate," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment. She had something she wanted to say. Evelyn could feel it, the way a coming storm makes the air feel heavier before it arrives. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said finally. "All right, my mother built this house. I don't mean she built it with her hands. I mean she made it what it was. The garden outside, the kitchen garden, the way the rooms were arranged, the meals we ate, the way the holidays were celebrated. It was hers." She paused. "It still is, even though she's gone." Evelyn let the silence sit for a moment before she answered. "I understand," she said, "and I'm not here to replace her." "No." Margaret's voice was flat. "You couldn't." "No," Evelyn agreed quietly. "I couldn't. No one could." That seemed to take Margaret somewhat off guard, the simple, direct agreement where she might have expected a protest or a justification. "What I can do," Evelyn said, "is help. In whatever way is actually useful, and in whatever way your family is comfortable with. Nothing more than that." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Supper is at 6, and went back down the hall. Supper at 6 was Thomas, tall and guarded, who looked at his father throughout the meal and barely spoke. It was Daniel, one of the twins, who argued with his brother about something they refused to explain to anyone else at the table until Caleb told them both in a flat, quiet voice to stop it. It was Ruth, who sat beside Evelyn without apparent hesitation and immediately began describing to her, in considerable detail, the personality of each of the ranch horses, unprompted. It was Clara, who had eaten half her supper and spent the rest of the time studying Evelyn with the undisguised analytical intensity of a 12-year-old who hasn't yet learned to conceal her curiosity. It was Henry, who ate quickly and asked to be excused before everyone else and ran out the back door. And it was Noah, 6 years old, with hair that needed cutting and his father's jaw in miniature and very large, very dark eyes that took in everything. He sat across the table from Evelyn, and for most of the meal he just watched her. Not with suspicion exactly, more like someone studying a very interesting new development in the world. Near the end of the meal, when most of the conversation had moved on, and the table had settled into that comfortable after-supper quiet, Noah looked at her directly and said, with no preamble, "Are you going to be our mother now?" The table went completely still. Caleb opened his mouth. Margaret's hand tightened on her fork. Clara made a small sound. "No," Evelyn said before anyone else could speak. She kept her voice gentle and direct, meeting the boy's eyes across the table. "Your mother was your mother, and nobody can take that place. That belongs to her." Noah considered this. "Then what are you going to be?" It was a genuine question. Children that age ask genuine questions. She thought about it for a moment, not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. "I'm going to try to be useful," she said, "and I hope, eventually, to be a friend." Noah appeared to weigh this. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of a very small person making a significant decision. "Okay," he said, and went back to his food. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ruth said, "Lightning likes apples, but thunder doesn't, which is strange because they're brothers." And the table exhaled and returned to itself. Moitz. Evelyn was awake at 5 the next morning. Not because she couldn't sleep. She'd slept, though briefly and not deeply, the unfamiliar sounds of the house and the land outside working their way into her rest. She was awake because she had things to learn, and there was no better time to start. She dressed in the dark, found her way downstairs without lighting a lamp, and spent 45 minutes simply walking through the ground floor rooms before anyone else was up. She was making a list in her head, not a dramatic one, not a list of failures or problems, but a practical inventory. The things that were done well, and the things that had slipped, and the things that had probably never been quite right. The kitchen was the heart of it. Margaret had kept it functional, even beyond functional. The larder was organized, the stove was maintained, the pots were clean. But there were things that had accumulated, jars that had been opened and not properly sealed and would need to be used quickly, a loose hinge on the back door that let in a draft. a set of shelves along the south wall that were bowing under too much weight and would eventually give way. The parlor had real potential under the disorder. Good furniture, a fireplace that drew well based on the clean ash, rugs that just needed beating, curtains that could be taken down and washed. The dining room was more of a challenge. It had become a secondary storage space, which meant things were in it that shouldn't be, and things were missing from it that should be there. The hall was manageable. She went back to the kitchen, built up the fire in the stove, and started coffee. By the time Margaret came downstairs at 5:20, there was coffee ready, and the back door's draft had been reduced to nothing by a rolled piece of canvas wedged under it temporarily until someone could fix the hinge properly. Margaret stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the coffee, at the door, at Evelyn standing at the stove. "I didn't ask you to eat," she started. "I know," Evelyn said. "I was up and I needed something to do. The coffee's for everyone. The door will need proper repair, but this'll hold it for now." She paused. "I can leave the rest to you if you'd prefer." Margaret stood there for a moment. Then she came fully into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. She didn't say anything, but she also didn't tell Evelyn to leave. They worked in the kitchen together in a silence that was uncomfortable at first, and then gradually, over the course of an hour, became something more like two women learning the rhythms of a shared space. The real introduction to the household's complexities came in fragments across the first week. Thomas, she figured out by the third day, was carrying something his father didn't know about. She couldn't tell what it was, not yet, but she recognized the signs. The way he came in from the range every evening with his shoulders set wrong. The way he sat at the supper table and ate without appetite but cleaned his plate anyway, as though eating was just another task to be completed. The way he looked at his father sometimes, a look that was part admiration and part something much more weighted. She didn't push. She watched. The twins were easier. They fought because they were bored and clever and required more engagement than the ranch routinely provided. Ruth was the thinker of the two. Daniel was the one who acted. Together they were exhausting and occasionally brilliant. Clara's studying eventually resolved into conversation. By the fourth day, she was asking Evelyn direct questions about Harrisburg, about the train journey, about what it was like to lose someone, with the bluntness of a child who had never learned to soften an inquiry. Evelyn answered honestly, which Clara clearly appreciated. Henry remained elusive. He appeared at meals, disappeared immediately after, and seemed to live primarily in the barn. And Noah. Noah had decided, with the complete and total commitment of a 6-year-old, that Evelyn was interesting. He followed her at a distance that he apparently believed was discreet, but which she was aware of approximately 100% of the time. He appeared in doorways. He showed up when she was in the kitchen, or in the hall, or on the back porch, always with something in his hand, a rock, a stick, a piece of twine, whatever the current treasure was, and always with something to say about it. She was never too busy for him. That wasn't a decision she made, it just turned out to be true. Ichem. Caleb Walker moved through his own house like a man who had learned to need very little from it. He was at breakfast, at supper, occasionally at midday. He was courteous, efficient, and thoroughly armored. He asked her twice in the first week if she needed anything and accepted no thank you without probing. He spoke to his children with a kind of earnest imprecision, loving them, visibly, but from a distance that had probably started as grief and calcified over 4 years into habit. One evening, near the end of her first week, Evelyn was in the parlor sorting through the accumulated paperwork on the side table when he came in and found her there. He stopped. "I'm not going through anything personal," she said before he could speak. "Just trying to find out if there's anything in here that's time-sensitive. Bills, notices. I found 2 letters from 3 weeks ago that looked like they might matter." She held them up. He crossed the room and took them, read them. His expression shifted slightly. Yes, I should have dealt with these." He looked at the sorted papers. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." He stood there for a moment with the letters in his hand, and she could see him working through something. Something about what she was, and whether she was what he'd expected, and what to do with the fact that she apparently wasn't. "The townspeople are talking," he said finally. She looked up. "About me?" "About the situation, the usual." He sat down in the chair across from the settee. It was the first time he'd sat down in the same room as her without the table between them. They think you came for the money." "I assumed they would," she said. "Did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I assumed you were practical," he said. "I understood that. And now?" He looked at the letters in his hand. "Now I think you're practical," he said, "but that's not all you are." She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she picked up the next paper from the pile and kept working. He stayed in the chair for almost an hour, reading through the papers she'd sorted, making notes in the margins of a few. It wasn't intimate, it wasn't particularly friendly, but it was the first time since she'd arrived that the house had felt, for a little while, like it had more than one adult in it. The town of Harlan's Crossing made its opinion known in the particular way that small towns do, through accumulated small signals rather than any direct statement. The woman at the dry goods store had been perfectly civil on Evelyn's first visit, but had made a point of looking very busy when she came back the second time. The wife of the county sheriff had introduced herself at the post office and smiled so warmly that every word felt like it was being filed away for later reference. Two women she didn't know had whispered to each other as she passed them on the main street and had stopped when she looked back and had not looked embarrassed. None of it surprised her. She had known, getting off the train, that this was what was waiting. A woman arriving from nowhere to marry into the wealthiest family in the area was always going to be looked at sideways. She'd made herself promises on the train about not letting it get under her skin. She was better at keeping that promise some days than others. What she was not prepared for was Marion Lowe. Marion was the wife of the second largest landowner in the area, a William Lowe who ran a smaller but still substantial cattle operation about 12 miles north of Walker Estate. She appeared at the estate on a Thursday afternoon in a spotless buggy driven by a young man who did not introduce himself, wearing a dress that had no business being worn for a midweek call and carrying a tin of what turned out to be surprisingly good shortbread. She was charming. Completely, thoroughly, deliberately charming. She sat in the parlor, which Margaret had offered with a stiffness that suggested she knew perfectly well what Marion Lowe's visits generally involved. And she asked Evelyn about her journey and her home back east and her impressions of the territory, and she listened to every answer with an expression of such attentive interest that a less experienced person might have taken it for genuine. "You must find it all so different," Marion said. She had pale blonde hair going silver at the temples, and eyes the color of winter ice, beautiful, cold, assessing. "It is different," Evelyn said, "but different isn't the same as bad." "Of course not." A small smile. "I imagine Caleb is glad to have someone managing things again. The house has been rather, well." She left it tactfully unfinished. "The family has done a remarkable job," Evelyn said. "Margaret especially." Marion's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Oh yes, remarkable." She picked up a piece of shortbread. "Of course, what these children really need is stability, permanence. Someone who truly belongs here." The implication sat in the air between them like smoke. Evelyn set down her teacup. "I think what children need," she said pleasantly, "is someone who shows up and does the work, whether or not they were born to it." Marion's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Quite right," she said, and changed the subject, and left 45 minutes later with the same air of unhurried friendliness that she'd arrived with. Evelyn sat in the parlor for a few minutes after the buggy had gone, looking at the half-empty tin of shortbread. Then she got up and went back to what she'd been doing. It was the broken shelf in the kitchen that finally, unexpectedly, shifted something. By the end of the first week, the bowing shelf had become a genuine concern. It held the heaviest jars and canisters, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and the wood was clearly not going to hold much longer. Evelyn had mentioned it to Caleb, who had said he'd have someone look at it. 3 days had passed, and nobody had looked at it. She wasn't going to wait. She found tools in the barn, better organized than she'd expected, which told her something about Caleb and the standard he kept his working equipment to, even when the house had been allowed to slip. She found the right lumber in a stack behind the barn. She had never built a shelf from scratch, but she had repaired enough things in her life to know the basic principles, and she spent a Saturday morning taking the old one down and putting up something that was, if not beautiful, substantially more structurally sound. She was in the middle of it, standing on a stool with a hammer, still 2 screws from finished, when she became aware that she had an audience. She looked down. Henry was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was the elusive one, the child who lived primarily in the barn and appeared at meals and vanished. He was 9 years old and looked at her now with an expression that was considerably less guarded than usual. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She looked at the shelf. "Am I?" "The angle of the bracket. It's not sitting flush. If you drive the screw in like that, it's going to pull the wood." She looked at it more carefully. He was absolutely right. "Show me," she said. He came into the kitchen. Apparently the shelf construction was sufficiently interesting to outweigh whatever impulse usually kept him at a distance. He climbed up onto the second stool and repositioned the bracket with the ease of someone who had been watching men build things his whole life, and showed her the angle it needed to be at. "You've done this before?" she asked. "Pa lets me help with the small repairs." A pause. "He used to, anyway. He's busy." "He is busy," she agreed. "Hold that, would you?" Henry held the bracket at the correct angle, and she drove the screw, and then the next one, and between the two of them the shelf went up straight and solid. They stepped back and looked at it. "Better," Henry said. "Much better," she agreed. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't push. She started moving the jars and canisters back to the shelf, handing the heavier ones down to him without comment, and he took them and helped arrange them on the new wood. When it was done, he said, still looking at the shelf, "My mother used to fix things herself, too. She said it was faster than waiting for someone else to do it." Evelyn felt the words settle in her chest. She was careful with her response, careful not to make too much of it, not to treat it like a gift being offered when he might just be reporting a fact. "She sounds like she was sensible," she said. "She was." A pause. "She was good at a lot of things." "I believe that." Henry stood there for another moment. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd left it on the table and put it on, and went back out through the kitchen door. And she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then silence. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, by the new shelf, with the smell of sawdust still in the air. Then she set the last jar in place, put the tools back where she'd found them, and started thinking about what to make for supper. Bossen. The thing about grief, Evelyn had learned by now. By 34, by losing a husband and a home and starting over in a place she'd never been, was that it didn't go away. It just changed shape. It went from something that was always in the foreground to something that was always in the background. And on good days you forgot it was there, and on hard days you turned around and walked straight into it. Walker Estate was full of grief that had changed shape and moved to the background and was still, every day, quietly running everything. It was in the empty chair at the head of the table that Caleb never sat in. He sat at the side always, leaving the head position technically vacant. It was in the garden outside the west-facing window that had been Eleanor's and had gone untended for 4 years and was now half wild. It was in the way Margaret's shoulders tightened when someone mentioned her mother's name, not with pain exactly, but with something that was past pain and into the territory of a wound that had healed badly. Evelyn didn't try to address any of it directly. She wasn't a fool. What she did was smaller. She fixed the shelf. She made a supper that was actually good. Not revolutionary, not performing effort, just well-made and warm, and put on the table on time. She found, in the pantry behind the flour, a jar of preserved cherries that had been there long enough to be a question mark, opened it, tasted it, declared it still good, and put it on the table at breakfast. She asked Ruth one evening, with genuine curiosity, to tell her more about thunder and lightning and the other horses, and listened to a 40-minute monologue that was more interesting than Ruth probably expected her to find it. She fixed the curtain rod in the front hall. She cleaned the windows in the parlor on a morning when the light was right for it, and the room afterward looked like a different place. She reorganized the coat rack into something that could accommodate human use. She found a hammer that belonged in the barn and put it back. None of it was dramatic. None of it was meant to be. But by the end of her second week at Walker Estate, the house smelled differently. It smelled like it had people in it, like coffee in the morning and real food at supper and something baked on Saturday afternoon. It smelled less like a place that was managing and more like a place that was living. Caleb noticed. She could tell by the way he moved through the rooms, a little less like a man navigating a space that had become foreign to him. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't expect him to. Not yet. There was time. There was work to be done. And she had learned, a long time ago, that the way you proved you belonged somewhere wasn't by announcing it. It was by showing up the next morning and doing it again. The shelf held. That was a small thing, and Evelyn knew it was a small thing. But on the morning of her 15th day at Walker Estate, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. The jars lined up, the wood still solid, the brackets sitting flush exactly the way Henry had shown her, and felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Not pride exactly, more like evidence, proof that a thing done carefully stayed done. She turned back to the stove and added another piece of wood to the fire. The house had its rhythms now, or she had learned them, which amounted to the same thing. Caleb left before first light every morning. She heard the back door, heard boots on the frozen ground, heard horses being brought around from the barn. Thomas went with him most days, and Daniel on alternating days, and the working day on Walker Estate began with a seriousness that made it clear why the operation had grown to the size it had. Margaret had breakfast on the table by 6:30. The younger children came down in their own order. Ruth first, then Clara, then Henry, and finally Noah, who treated getting out of bed as a negotiation rather than a requirement. Evelyn had settled into the space of helping rather than leading, which was the right thing to do, and she knew it. She was not the one in charge of this kitchen. Margaret was. What Evelyn could do was stand beside her and take the parts that needed doing without being asked, and do them without commentary, and over the past 2 weeks that approach had produced results that were less like truce and more like something. She wasn't sure what to call it yet. What she was sure of was that it was fragile, and she treated it accordingly. It was Margaret who told her about the Founders' Day supper, on a morning when they were working side by side at the kitchen counter, one of them rolling pastry and the other chopping dried apple for filling. "It's in 3 weeks," Margaret said without particular preamble. She said most things without particular preamble. "The whole valley comes. It's at the Morrow place this year." Morrow? James Morrow. He runs the feed operation south of town. His wife Agnes organizes it. A pause. "They've organized it for the last 12 years. Eleanor, my mother, used to help." Evelyn kept rolling. "What's expected of the Walker family?" Margaret glanced at her sideways. "We bring food. We attend. We are visible." "And what does visible mean this year?" The pastry got one more roll before Margaret answered. "It means you'll be there, and they'll be looking." "I assumed they would be." "You assumed it from here. It's different when you're standing in the middle of it and Agnes Morrow is asking you questions that sound polite but aren't." Evelyn put the rolling pin down. "What kind of questions does Agnes Morrow ask?" "Where you're from, what your people were, whether you have any family back east." A pause. "Whether you were married before." "I was married before." "I know, they'll want to know why that ended and whether there's something—" She stopped. "Whether there's something you're not saying." There it was. Evelyn looked at the chopped apple for a moment. It was always there eventually, in any conversation that got close enough to the truth, the implication that the reason she'd ended up answering a frontier marriage advertisement rather than staying where she was must say something about her. That women who arrived by train to marry strangers had something to account for, something missing or wrong or insufficient. "My husband died," Evelyn said. "We had a house, a business, a life. The business was in his name. When he died, there was debt I didn't know about. And when the debt was settled, there was nothing. No house, no money, no family, left close enough to matter." She paused. "I had options, and they were all bad ones. This seemed like the least bad." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And is it?" she asked. "Less bad?" "Ask me in a year," Evelyn said and picked up the rolling pin again. Something shifted in Margaret's face. Small, almost imperceptible, but there. She went back to the apples, and they worked in silence for a while. And when Margaret spoke again, it was about the supper menu for that evening, and the conversation about Founders' Day was over for the time being. But it had happened, and both of them knew it had happened. Bet. The weather turned at the end of Evelyn's second week, not to winter yet. November was still wearing autumn's clothes, cold at night, but clear and bright by mid-morning. But the temperature dropped enough that the mornings had a serious edge to them, and the afternoon light went golden and thin rather than the broader warmth of October. The ranch shifted accordingly. There was wood to be cut and stacked, equipment to be checked and stored, cattle to be moved to winter grazing. The working day got longer and the men came in tired in a different way than they'd been tired before. A deeper tired that had to do with weather resistance rather than just labor. Caleb was absent from the house more than he'd been in the first weeks. Not in a way that required comment. It was simply the nature of running a ranch this size as the season changed. But Evelyn noticed it, and she noticed that the children noticed it, and she noticed particularly that Noah noticed it in the way youngest children notice the absence of parents. Not with drama, but with a quiet readjustment, a compensating look for the available adult. She was usually available. She found him on a Tuesday afternoon in the small room off the kitchen that Margaret used for storing preserves and extra dry goods. He was sitting on the floor behind a row of shelving with a piece of string and what appeared to be a very serious cat's cradle in progress. "Working on something?" she asked from the doorway. "Trying to make a star," he said. He held it up. It did not look like a star. She came in and sat on the floor beside him. "Can I see?" He handed it over without hesitation. She turned it in her fingers, figuring out where the pattern had gone wrong, then handed it back with the correction. "Try that one." He tried it. It still didn't look like a star, but it looked more like it was trying to. "Ruth taught me," he said. "She's better at it. Ruth's good at things that take patience. She says I move too fast." He paused. "She says that about everything." "Do you?" He considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Sometimes. But sometimes fast is right." "That's true," Evelyn agreed. "Knowing which is which takes a while to figure out." He looked at the string in his hands. "My papa moves slow," he said. "Not critical, just observational. He thinks a long time before he does things. That can be useful too." "He's sad," Noah said, still just reporting. "He was sad before you came. He's still sad, but I think maybe a little less." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. "Are you sad?" Noah asked. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, because he'd earned that. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss my home, the place I grew up. Not the things in it, just the feeling of knowing where everything is." He nodded like that made complete sense. "I always know where everything is here," he said. "Maybe that will help." She looked at him, this small, serious-faced boy with his piece of string and his father's jaw, and felt something in her chest that was too complicated and too new to look at directly. "Maybe it will," she said. The whispers from town arrived at the estate in the form of Marian Lowe's second visit. She came on a Friday this time, again in the spotless buggy, again with something baked, this time a poppy seed loaf that Evelyn suspected she had not made herself. The visit was shorter, the charm thinner, the probing less concealed. "I heard you've been making changes to the house," Marian said, sitting in the parlor with her teacup held just slightly too precisely. "Small ones," Evelyn said, "a shelf, some curtains down for washing. The girls at the Ladies' Aid were saying, well," she smiled. The smile had learned nothing from its previous visit. "You know how people talk. Some felt it was rather quickly done." "People are welcome to their opinions," Evelyn said pleasantly. Marian's head tilted slightly. "Of course. We all want what's best for the Walker family. They've been through so much." A pause. "Caleb is a wonderful man. He deserves someone who, well, someone who fits the position." "What does fitting the position look like to you?" Evelyn asked. Not hostile. Genuinely curious in tone, even though the curiosity was actually something slightly sharper. Marian blinked. The directness had surprised her. "Someone the community knows, someone with roots here or the right kind of family connections. The Walkers are the first family of this territory, in many ways. The woman in that house carries a certain responsibility." Evelyn set down her teacup. "Mrs. Lowe," she said, "I think we both know that what you're describing isn't a responsibility, it's a qualification. And I think you'd find, if you looked carefully, that being born somewhere and knowing the right people and having the right connections isn't what makes someone good for a family." Marian's smile stayed. "You're very direct. I was told it was faster." A pause. Something moved in Marian's eyes. Not anger exactly, but the adjustment of a calculation. "Well," she said, and set her own teacup down. "I suppose we'll see." She left 10 minutes later. Margaret, who had been in the kitchen within earshot of most of it, came to the doorway when the buggy had cleared the lane. "She'll go straight back to town," Margaret said. "I know. And she'll tell them everything." "I know that too." Margaret leaned against the doorframe. "You're not worried?" Evelyn looked at the half-eaten poppy seed loaf on the table. "If I spent my energy worrying about what Marion Lowe is saying about me in town, I'd have no energy left for anything that actually matters." She paused. "Is that a problem?" Margaret considered this for a moment. "No," she said. "Actually, no." The town of Harlan's Crossing expressed its opinion more directly the following week, when Evelyn went in on her own for the first time. Caleb had offered to send a man with her. She'd declined. She needed to know what it was like on her own terms, without the buffer of his name walking alongside her in the form of an employee. The dry goods store was her first stop. The woman behind the counter, her name was Dora Pruitt, as it turned out, some relation to the Mrs. Pruitt who came to help with laundry, greeted her with the bright courtesy of someone who had been briefed. "Mrs. Carter, how are you finding the estate?" "Very well, thank you." "And the children? Such wonderful children. Eleanor raised them beautifully." "She did. They're remarkable." A slight emphasis on the past tense. Evelyn filed it and moved on. The real trouble came at the post office. She was waiting for the clerk to check the box when the door opened and two women came in together. She knew one of them by sight as Agnes Morrow, who was approximately what she'd expected from Margaret's description, 50-ish, organized, wearing her social standing as visibly as her dress. The other woman she didn't know. Agnes Morrow spotted her immediately. "Mrs. Carter!" The warmth was immediate and comprehensive. "What a fortunate coincidence. I've been hoping to meet you properly." "Mrs. Morrow." They shook hands. The grip was cordial and analytical. "I've heard a great deal about the Founders' Day supper." "Oh, we're so looking forward to having the Walker family join us again." A meaningful pause that was probably not meant to seem as meaningful as it did. "It's been several years since the family has been present in that way." "I hope we can change that," Evelyn said. The woman with Agnes Morrow had been doing the particular thing that people do when they want to listen to a conversation without appearing to. Looking at the mail sorting window, adjusting a glove, not quite looking at either of them. "This is Vera Hutchins," Agnes said. "Her husband runs the bank." "Mrs. Hutchins." Another handshake. "Vera, Mrs. Carter is the new—" A brief pause, during which Agnes Morrow managed to convey an entire editorial opinion in the gap of 2 or 3 syllables. "Addition to the Walker household." "So I understand," said Vera Hutchins. She had a pleasant face and careful eyes. "You've come a long way." "From Harrisburg," Evelyn said. Vera looked at her with the particular evaluating expression of a banker's wife. "Caleb is a good man," she said. "Whatever people say, he's a genuinely good man. He deserves to be treated accordingly. The implication was clear, and you'd better." "I agree completely," Evelyn said. She collected her mail from the clerk, said her goodbyes with the correct degree of warmth and brevity, and walked back out into the November air. She stood on the main street for a moment, the mail in her hands, and looked up at the sky. Pale gray, thin clouds moving fast from the northwest. She was not particularly discouraged. She had known this was coming. She was tired, which was different. Tired of having to prove that she was not the thing they'd already decided she was. Tired of the small, constant expenditure of energy that went into managing other people's assumptions. But discouragement was a different thing. Discouragement required believing that what they thought mattered more than what was actually happening. She didn't believe that. She got back in the wagon and drove home. The incident that changed things, not dramatically, not permanently, but in the particular way that a gear catches and holds, was not planned. It happened on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after her arrival, on an afternoon when the wind had come up from the north and the temperature had dropped fast. She was in the kitchen when she heard the argument. Not a quiet argument. Not the low-negotiated disagreement of people who have been in the same space too long. An actual argument coming from the room beyond the parlor that served as Caleb's study. A raised voice, then 2 raised voices, then a door that didn't quite slam but came close. Thomas came out of the study with a face that had gone white around the jaw and red across the cheekbones. He crossed the hall, without looking at anyone, got his coat from the rack, from the properly organized coat rack, and went out through the front door. Evelyn looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at the study door. "That's been building for a while," Margaret said quietly. "What's it about?" Margaret hesitated. This was the hesitation of someone deciding how much of a private family thing to share with a person who was technically in the family, but also technically not. Evelyn watched her work through it and didn't push. "Thomas wants to go to school," Margaret said finally. "Proper school. There's an engineering program in Denver. He's been accepted." She paused. "Pa doesn't... He needs Thomas on the ranch." "Needs him," Evelyn repeated. "Thomas is good with the cattle, with the equipment. He thinks like Pa does. Daniel would rather be anywhere else." She folded her arms. "Pa's not wrong that Thomas leaving is a problem, but Thomas isn't wrong that he has a right to want something different." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "How long has Thomas been accepted to this program?" "Since September. So 3 months. 3 months of carrying it, and it had finally broken the surface today." She left the kitchen and knocked on the study door. There was a silence, and then Caleb's voice, with the controlled flatness of a man reining himself in. "Yes." She opened the door. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, not looking at her. "I assumed it was Margaret." "No." She came a few steps into the room and stopped. "I heard." His shoulders were set in that way she'd come to recognize. The way he went rigid. When something had gotten past the defenses, he usually kept in very good order. "It's a family matter," he said. "I know it is." "Then I'm not sure what you—" "I'm not here to get involved in it," she said. "I just wanted to say, I know what it looks like from where you're standing, losing your best help just as the work is heaviest. I understand that." He turned from the window. His face was still composed, but the effort showed at the edges. "You're going to tell me I should let him go?" "I'm not here to tell you anything." She paused. "I'm just thinking, a boy who's been accepted to a program and hasn't told his father for 3 months is a boy who already knew what the answer was going to be. And whatever you decide, that part is worth thinking about." Caleb looked at her. It was a different kind of look than she'd gotten from him before. Not assessing, not careful. Something that was trying to figure out what to do with a statement that was both true and unwelcome. She left him with it and went back to the kitchen. She didn't know if it had helped. She didn't know if it was her place. She was still working that out every day. What her place was and wasn't. Where the line was between being present in a family and overstepping it. It wasn't a clean line. It was a line that moved depending on the day. But she thought she'd stayed on the right side of it, this time. Well, the following morning, Thomas was at the breakfast table. He hadn't been, the night before. He'd come in after supper and gone straight upstairs, and nobody had pressed him. The family had gotten good at giving each other room. It was a skill that came from years of needing it. At breakfast, he was quiet, drinking coffee and eating without his usual efficiency, slower, like his mind was somewhere else. Caleb was at the table too, which was less common midweek. He ate steadily without looking at Thomas, and Thomas ate without looking at him, and around them Ruth was explaining to Noah why horses couldn't eat the same things that dogs ate, and Clara was reading a book propped against the salt cellar, which she knew wasn't permitted at the table and was doing anyway. Evelyn set a fresh pot of coffee on the table and turned to go back to the stove. "Evelyn," Caleb said. She turned. He had his cup in both hands and he was looking at it rather than at her. "There are 2 horses that need their shoes looked at before the real cold comes. I meant to ask, do you know whether Henry's done it, or should I send for the farrier?" It was not a remarkable question. It was a completely normal operational question about the running of the ranch. But he had said her name. First name, not Mrs. Carter, first name. With the ease of someone who had made a decision about it and executed it without announcement. She recovered in about half a second. "I don't know," she said. "I'll ask Henry." He nodded, drank his coffee. Across the table she caught Margaret's eyes. Margaret looked quickly back at her plate. Nothing was said about it. Nothing needed to be. But at some point in the night, something had shifted in the architecture of the household, quietly, without fanfare, the way a door long stuck finally catches a dry day and swings free. She asked Henry about the horses. He told her one had been done and one hadn't, and then, unprompted, asked if she wanted to come look at the one that hadn't, to understand what the problem was. She said yes, and they spent an hour in the barn, and he explained the shoe and the hoof and the particular way cold ground could affect a horse that hadn't been properly prepared for it. And she listened to all of it and asked questions that were genuine rather than performed. And by the end of it, Henry had used approximately 3 times as many words as he usually produced in a full day. She didn't comment on that. She thanked him, went back to the house, and told Caleb the farrier needed to come for the gray. That evening, while she was in the parlor mending a tear in one of Noah's shirts that Margaret had put aside, Thomas came in. He stood for a moment, looking at the room that she'd cleaned and straightened and rearranged slightly, the curtains washed and rehung, the rugs beaten, the fire laid and burning. He looked at it like he was seeing it slightly differently than he had before. "You know Margaret used to do all this," he said. "She still does most of it. She let you help." "She did." Evelyn kept her eyes on the mending. "She's a capable person who is doing more than was reasonable on her own. Having help doesn't diminish the original work." Thomas sat down in one of the armchairs. He had his father's way of occupying furniture. Direct, not decorative. "Pa sent for the farrier," he said. "Henry told me one of the horses needed it." "That's not what I meant." He looked at the fire. He's been making decisions differently this week. Asking more questions. Listening to the answers. She didn't say anything. "My mother used to do that," Thomas said. "Make him talk through things rather than just deciding." He paused. "Not by arguing with him, just by asking the right question at the right time." Evelyn pulled the thread through carefully. "I'm not trying to be your mother." "I know." He looked at his hands for a moment. "That's not what I'm saying." He seemed to struggle with the rest of it, the words sitting behind the expression and not quite coming forward. "I'm saying, thank you, for what you said to him yesterday." She looked up from the mending. He was looking at her directly, and he had his father's eyes, and the expression in them was undefended in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "He came to my room last night," Thomas said. "We talked. Actually talked." A long pause. "He said I could go in January, that he'd hire an additional man to make up the difference." He stopped. "I didn't expect that." "What did you expect?" "I expected to lose the argument and leave anyway eventually, or not leave." He shook his head. "I've been angry for a long time. I thought it was just him, but I think some of it was that nobody was translating." She set the mending in her lap. "You don't need a translator," she said. "He loves you. That was clear in everything I heard." "Then why?" "Because love doesn't mean the same thing as understanding," she said. "Sometimes it doesn't even overlap much. Those are 2 separate skills." Thomas was quiet for a while. The fire popped once, settled. "You're very direct," he said. "People keep telling me that," she said, and went back to the mending. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it retreated. Then he stood, said good night, and went upstairs. She sat with the mending and the fire and the sound of the wind outside and thought about what it cost to keep showing up to something that hadn't asked for you. It cost quite a lot, she decided. But the ledger wasn't balanced daily. It was balanced over time. She thought she was getting ahead of where she'd started. The Founders' Day supper arrived on a Saturday 3 weeks later, and Evelyn dressed for it with the particular care of someone who understood that clothing was sometimes a form of argument. She had one good dress. Dark green wool, well made, nothing fashionable, but nothing shabby. She had a coat that was warm and presentable. She did her hair without asking for help, and it came out, if not exceptional, at least correct. She came downstairs to find Margaret in the kitchen, still in her everyday dress, checking the pie crust for the dessert they were bringing. Margaret looked at her. "You look fine," she said. "Thank you. I mean it. You look like someone who belongs there." It was not a complicated sentence. It was entirely possible that Margaret had simply meant it practically, that she looked like a respectable woman who could walk into a community supper without embarrassing anyone. But the word she'd chosen, belongs, sat in the air between them for a moment with more weight than its immediate meaning. "Are you coming?" Evelyn asked. "Of course." Margaret untied her apron. "I just need to change." The Walker family arrived at the Morrow place in 2 wagons, slightly late. Not because anyone was unprepared, but because Noah had changed his clothes twice and Ruth and Daniel had argued briefly and with some volume about a seating arrangement that Caleb resolved by simply putting them in separate wagons. They arrived, therefore, in a mild state of disorganization that was not dissimilar to how any family with 7 children might be expected to arrive anywhere. The Morrow place was large and lit up and full of people. Evelyn walked in beside Caleb, which was where she was supposed to be, and felt the room register their arrival in the quiet but comprehensive way a room does when it has been waiting for something. Agnes Morrow greeted them at the door. The greeting was effusive and specifically calibrated, warm to Caleb, marginally warmer to the children, and to Evelyn the particular warmth of someone who had not yet made a final decision. "We're so pleased you could all come," Agnes said. She said it to Caleb, and it swept to include the children and came to rest on Evelyn with the quality of an assessment. "We're glad to be here," Evelyn said. The evening did what these evenings do. It circulated. People moved from group to group, food was brought out, conversations overlapped and separated. Caleb was sought out by men who wanted to talk cattle prices and territory politics. The children found each other's approximate equivalents in the room. Evelyn was left, at various points, with various women who asked the expected questions in the expected ways. She answered them honestly and without defensiveness. Where she was from, what her husband had done, how she'd come to answer the advertisement. She said it plainly, without apology, and without the softening that would have signaled she thought there was something to be sorry for. Some of the women, hearing it plain, relaxed. Not all. Vera Hutchins found her near the dessert table, an hour in. "You're doing well," Vera said, which was an unusual thing to say, and clearly meant it. "Better than I expected, honestly." "Is that a compliment or a confession?" Evelyn asked. Vera laughed, a genuine one. "Both, probably." She looked across the room toward where Caleb was talking with a group of men. "He's talked to Thomas this week, really talked. In 4 years, I've watched him not do that." Evelyn said nothing. "Whatever you said to him," Vera said, "it worked." She paused. "He's not an easy man. He never has been. Eleanor managed him beautifully, but it took her years to learn how, and even then it wasn't perfect." She looked at Evelyn directly. "What you're doing, it's not nothing. Whatever people are saying." "What are they saying?" "That you're after his money." Vera picked up a piece of pie. "Most of them. A few are saying you're actually quite capable, and they're not sure what to do with that." "Which group are you in?" "The second one," Vera said, "and it's a better group to be in." It was, Evelyn thought, probably the most useful conversation she'd had since she arrived. She found Caleb on her way back from the dessert table. He was standing at the edge of a group holding a cup of coffee, and when she stopped beside him, he shifted slightly to include her in the angle of the conversation without making a production of it. Small thing, she noticed it. Later, walking to the wagon to leave, Noah reached up and took her hand without looking at her, with the natural ease of a child who has decided that someone is safe. She took it and walked with it in hers, and didn't say anything about it. Caleb, on her other side, saw it. He didn't say anything about it either, but the set of his jaw was different on the ride home, less like a man bracing against something and more like a man who had, for a few hours at least, let something unfamiliar carry some of the weight. She watched the road in the dark and felt, for the first time since she'd climbed down from the train in Harlan's Crossing, that she might actually be going to be all right here. Not happy, not yet. Happy was a complicated word, and she'd learned to be careful with it, but something steadier than surviving, something that was, at least, the beginning of a path toward the kind of life you could actually live in, rather than just endure. The wagon moved through the cold dark, and the stars were out, and she held Noah's hand the rest of the way home. The first real snow came on a Wednesday. Not a heavy snow. Not yet. Not the kind that closed roads and kept the ranch hands in the bunkhouse for days at a time. Just an inch or two overnight, enough to change the color of the world by morning, to make the corrals and the barn roof and the long fence lines look like something from a different kind of life than the brown grass November they'd been living in. Noah stood at the kitchen window in his socks and stared at it with the complete arrested attention of a child for whom winter was still a thing that happened to him, rather than something he'd learned to work around. "It'll melt by noon," Henry said, from the table, with the authority of someone who had seen this before. "Maybe," Noah said. He didn't move from the window. "It will. First snow always does." "I know." He pressed his palm flat against the glass. I just want to look at it while it's there." Evelyn set a bowl of oatmeal in front of Henry and didn't say anything. She understood the impulse, the desire to stay with the thing before it changed. She'd felt it herself more times than she could count over the past month. The particular quality of a moment that you already knew was temporary, but wanted to hold anyway. The month since Founders' Day had settled into something she hadn't expected. Normalcy. Not comfort, not yet, and not without its rough edges. But something that functioned. The house ran. Meals were made and eaten. The children went about their days. Caleb went out before dawn and came back at dark and ate his supper, and sometimes stayed in the parlor afterward, and sometimes didn't. Margaret had stopped looking at Evelyn as though she might at any moment do something that needed to be stopped. That was its own kind of progress. Thomas had begun packing for Denver. He was going in January, and the knowledge of that, now acknowledged, now real, had taken something out of the air that Evelyn hadn't known was there until it was gone. Some compressed tension that had been sitting in the household for months had released. He was still quiet at the table, still careful with his words the way cautious people are when they've been wrong about something and haven't finished being surprised by it. But he sat in the same room as his father now in the evenings sometimes, which he hadn't done before. And if they didn't talk much, they also didn't perform the elaborate non-conversation of two people actively avoiding each other. Small things. They were always small things. The fever started on a Thursday night, near the end of November. She heard Noah before she saw him, a small shuffling sound in the hallway outside her room, the particular sound of a child moving without his usual energy, uncertain on his feet. She was awake within seconds. She'd been a light sleeper since before she came here, since the year after James died when worry had colonized her sleep so thoroughly that it had never fully left. She opened her door. He was standing in this hallway in his nightshirt, one hand against the wall. Even in the dim light from the window at the end of the hall, she could see it, the way his skin had gone wrong, that particular dullness that a fever gave to a child's face, and his eyes were glassy, slightly unfocused. "Noah." "I don't feel right," he said. His voice was smaller than usual. She crossed to him and put her hand on his forehead. The heat came up through her palm like a brand. Not a mild, "I might be coming down with something" heat. This was the heat of a fever that had been building for hours while he slept and had arrived somewhere serious. "Come with me," she said. She took his hand. His hand was hot too, dry, and led him back to his room. He was passive in a way that scared her. Noah was never passive. He always had something to say, some observation, some question, some piece of string. He lay down when she directed him to, and he looked up at the ceiling with those two bright eyes, and he didn't say anything. She touched his neck. The glands there were swollen, distinct under her fingers. She checked his breathing, which was faster than it should have been. Not labored, but fast. "Does anything hurt?" she asked. "My head," he said. "And cold. I'm cold." She tucked the blankets more tightly around him and went to get another quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed. She covered him with it. She felt his forehead again. If anything, in the 2 minutes since she'd found him in the hall, it had gotten worse. She went across the hall and knocked on Margaret's door. Margaret opened it quickly. She was a light sleeper too, apparently, or Evelyn's footsteps in the hall had woken her. She took one look at Evelyn's face and said, "Which one?" "Noah." Margaret's face changed. It went through something, a sequence Evelyn didn't have time to read carefully, but the end result of it was a face that was 2 shades paler than it had been, then and very, very still. "How bad?" Margaret said. "Bad enough," Evelyn said. "I need to know how far the doctor is." "Ridgeville. Dr. Hartwell. 4 hours by wagon, maybe less if the road's clear." Margaret's voice was controlled. She was working hard to keep it that way. "But he doesn't always come out at night. Last time we sent, it was spring. Henry had an infection. He came by morning. 4 hours there, 4 hours back, assuming the doctor came immediately. The snow had melted from 2 days ago, but the temperature had dropped hard since then, and the road to Ridgeville went through low ground that would be frozen and rough. "Wake your father," Evelyn said. Margaret went. Evelyn went back to Noah. He was shivering now despite the 2 quilts, which was the fever doing what fevers do, spiking and making the body lie to itself about its own temperature. She lit the lamp on his nightstand, and in the better light she could see what she hadn't been able to in the hallway. The color in his cheeks was wrong, too high and too concentrated, that fever flush that looked like rouge on a doll. His breathing had picked up another notch. "Stay with me," she said quietly. Not dramatically, just steadily. "I'm here," he said. "I know. Keep talking to me." "About what?" "Anything." She pulled her chair close to his bed and sat. "Tell me about Thunder." He started to talk, in the halting, heat-blurred way of a child with a high fever, about the horse, about how Thunder liked to push his nose against your shoulder, but you had to be ready or it knocked you sideways, about how in summer he stood in the water trough up to his knees and Henry had to chase him out, about how his eyes were the same color as the sky right before a storm. She listened to every word and kept her hand on his wrist, feeling his pulse, and said nothing about what she was actually measuring. Caleb came into the room 4 minutes after she'd sent Margaret for him. He was still pulling on his coat over his shirt, hair uncombed, and the expression on his face when he saw Noah was the expression of a man who has been waiting for something terrible without knowing what form it would take. He crossed to the bed and crouched down so he was at eye level with his son. He put his hand on Noah's face. Evelyn watched him absorb the heat, watched the muscle in his jaw tighten. "I'm getting the wagon," he said. "The road to Ridgeville," she started. "I don't care about the road." "I know you don't. But 4 hours out, 4 hours back, and we don't know if Hartwell will come immediately. That's 8 hours minimum." She paused. "Let me work on his fever while you get the wagon ready. If I can bring it down some, we have more time to get the doctor here safely. If I can't—" She stopped. "If you can't what?" His voice was flat and tight. "Then we go to Ridgeville, however the road is, and we deal with the road." He looked at her. She could see him weighing it, the instinct to move, to do something physical and immediate, against the logic of what she was saying. She could also see something else in his face that she didn't want to look at directly. Fear. Not the controlled, managed kind. Real fear. The kind that lived underneath all the management. The kind you couldn't reason yourself out of. "Last time a fever like this came into this house," he said quietly, and then he stopped. "Eleanor." She knew that's what he'd stopped himself from finishing. "I know," she said. She kept her voice steady, not because she wasn't scared. She was genuinely frightened. This fever was serious and she knew it. But because the room needed one steady voice, and she was the one who had to provide it. "Get the wagon ready. Get Daniel or Thomas up to ride to Ridgeville. They can go faster than a wagon. Get the message to Hartwell now. Tell him to come at first light at the very latest." "Tkas is tuas." She paused. "And get me cold water and as many clean cloths as Margaret can find." He stood. He looked at her for one more second, not with suspicion, not with the careful, guarded distance of their first weeks, but with something raw and undefended that was hard to hold in her peripheral vision without feeling it in her chest. Then he went. On. The night was the longest she could remember in recent experience. It moved in the way that bad nights do, not smoothly, not in the regular rhythm of hours marked by a clock, but in chunks that were alternately too fast and too slow. Stretches of 10 minutes that felt like an hour. A half hour that went by in what seemed like moments. Margaret brought the water and cloths. She stood in the doorway afterward, not quite entering, watching. "Do you know what you're doing?" she asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, the question of someone who needed to know the answer. "My grandmother was a healer," Evelyn said, wringing out a cloth and folding it. "Not a doctor, but she knew fevers. She raised 11 children and only lost one, and that one wasn't to fever." She looked up. "I'm not a doctor either, but I know what to do while we wait for one." She put the cloth on Noah's forehead. He flinched at the cold. "That's bad," he said. "I know. It helps anyway." "How?" "Because your body is too hot. Cold pulls the heat out." He considered this with the fevered version of his usual serious consideration. "Like a draft," he said. Exactly like a draft. Margaret came in and sat on the other side of the bed. She didn't ask permission, and Evelyn didn't suggest she needed it. Together they worked, changing the cloths, monitoring his breathing, getting him to drink small amounts of water when he would, which was not often, but often enough. Caleb appeared in the doorway twice during the night. He didn't come in. He stood there looking at his son and looked at Evelyn, and she gave him a small nod each time. Not all clear, not good news, but still here, still working. And after a moment, he went back down the hall. She heard him on the stairs. She heard him in the kitchen, the sound of the stove being stoked, the kettle set on. He was doing what men like him did when they couldn't do the thing they most needed to do. He was keeping busy. Around 2 in the morning, Noah's fever spiked. She felt it change, not gradually but suddenly, the way sometimes a fire goes from burning to blazing. His temperature, which had been high but stable for several hours, went higher. He stopped trying to talk. He went into a kind of half-sleep that wasn't rest. She could see his eyes moving behind his closed lids, the rapid movement of a mind being troubled by heat dreams. "Margaret," she said. Margaret, who had been half-dozing in the chair, snapped awake. She looked at Noah. She looked at Evelyn. "How bad?" she said, and her voice came out thin. "We need to cool him faster." Evelyn was already calculating. "Is there still ice in the ice house? From summer?" "Some. There should be. Get Henry. He's quiet enough not to wake the younger ones. I need ice in a cloth, wrapped, not touching the skin directly, alongside his neck and under his arms." She was already changing the cloth on his forehead, working fast. "And I need your father." Margaret went. She moved fast, faster than Evelyn had seen her move, and the house came quietly alive around them. Footsteps on the stairs, a door opening, a whispered conversation. Caleb was in the doorway in less than 2 minutes. He took one look and came fully into the room for the first time all night. He sat on the edge of the bed on the side opposite Evelyn and put his hand on Noah's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, and his face did something that Evelyn looked away from because it was private. "Tell me what to do," he said. Not, "What's happening?" Not, "Is he going to be all right?" Tell me what to do. She could work with that. Hold him still if he starts to move. Sometimes when the fever is this high, they get restless and try to throw the covers off. He needs to stay covered. "All right. Talk to him. Even if he seems asleep. Hearing a familiar voice, it helps. I don't know exactly why, but it does." He shifted closer to Noah and put his hand against his son's face and started talking. Low, very low. She could barely make out the words. Something about the ranch, about the cattle, about the spring that was coming, about a colt that was going to be born in March that Noah had already declared was going to be his. His voice was rough, and it wasn't steady, but it was there, constant, like a rope thrown into the dark. Henry arrived with the ice, wrapped carefully in linen the way she'd asked, not quite understanding why, but doing it correctly anyway, because Henry did things correctly when he was given the information to work from. She positioned it, checked Noah's breathing again, changed the cloth on his forehead for the 7th time that night. The hours wore on. She didn't know when she'd stopped being cold. She was sitting in the wooden chair she'd pulled up to his bedside, and she'd been there for, she didn't know, 3 hours, 4. Her back ached, her eyes were dry. She kept changing the cloths and kept watching his breathing and kept measuring, against her fingers on his wrist, the rhythm of his pulse. Clara appeared at the door sometime around 3 in the morning. She was in her nightgown and her hair was loose, and she had the wide-awake look of a child who has been lying in bed knowing something was wrong and finally unable to stay there. "How is he?" she whispered. "Holding," Evelyn said. "Is he going to—" "We're doing everything that can be done," Evelyn said. "Go back to bed, Clara." "I don't want to." Evelyn looked at her. A 12-year-old who had already lost her mother to an illness that had arrived just like this in the night without sufficient warning, who had been told, probably, to go back to bed then too. "Pull that chair to the door," she said. "You can sit there, but stay in the doorway." Clara pulled the chair, sat in it, wrapped her arms around her own knees, and watched. Nobody told her again to leave. The fever broke at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. It didn't break dramatically. It broke the way a fever actually breaks, gradually and then unmistakably. She was changing the cloth on his forehead when she noticed that the cloth was coming away less hot than the last one. She checked his pulse. It had slowed, marginally but definitively. She put her hand flat on his cheek. Still hot, but the edge of it was different. The terrible sustained intensity of the past 2 hours had gone out of it, replaced by something that was still a fever but was a fever that was retreating rather than advancing. She sat back in her chair. She realized her hands were shaking and pressed them flat on her thighs and breathed. Caleb was still holding his son's hand. He'd been talking intermittently all night, running out of things to say and starting again, the way a person does when they're talking to keep themselves from going silent. He looked at Noah, and then he looked at Evelyn. She gave him a small nod. He looked at his son's face for a long moment. Then he put his forehead down against his clasped hands and stayed like that, without moving, for about 30 seconds. It was the most private thing she'd ever seen a person do in front of another person. She looked at the window, where the dark was beginning to go thin at the edges. "The fever's turning," she said quietly. "He needs to sleep. Real sleep. Keep him warm, but not too warm. Leave one quilt, not two. Keep giving him water when he'll take it." She paused. "Dr. Hartwell will still need to come. I want him examined properly." Caleb lifted his head, agreed. His voice was wrecked, low and rough from a night of talking with a dry throat. He looked at her, and she could see the full weight of the night in his face, the relief and the exhaustion and the residue of fear that doesn't just disappear because the immediate crisis has passed. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, and they were plainly meant, and she didn't try to deflect them. "He's not out of it yet, but I think he's going to be all right." "You think, or I think," she said. "I told you, I'm not a doctor. Get Hartwell here, and he can tell you for certain." Caleb nodded. He looked at Noah for a long moment. The boy was breathing steadily now, color still too high, but the glassiness fading, his face peaceful in the first real sleep of the night. Then he stood, and he looked at Evelyn, and there was something in the look that she wasn't ready to name. She looked away first, not from discomfort, but from the sense that some things needed time before they could be looked at directly. In the doorway, Claire had fallen asleep in her chair, legs curled up under her nightgown, chin dropped to her chest. Evelyn got up and went to her and draped the extra quilt over her, and she didn't stir. Margaret was in the hallway, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. She'd been there for some portion of the night. Evelyn didn't know how much. "He's going to be okay," Evelyn said quietly. Margaret looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, her jaw was working slightly, which was the most visible display of emotion Evelyn had seen from her. "I know what you did tonight," Margaret said. "I know what that—" She stopped, tried again. "When my mother was sick, there was nothing anyone could do. There was no—" Another stop. "Nobody knew what to do. We just watched." Evelyn was very still. "You knew what to do," Margaret said. You knew." "I was scared the whole time," Evelyn said honestly. "I know you were." Margaret unfolded her arms, refolded them. "It didn't show." "It never does." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. And then she did something that Evelyn had not expected and had not been bracing for. She stepped forward and put her arms around her. It was brief. It was slightly awkward in the way of someone who has not done that with a particular person before. It was also entirely real. Evelyn stood still for a moment and then put her arms around the girl and held on for the few seconds that it lasted. Margaret stepped back. She didn't say anything else. She went to the kitchen, and Evelyn heard the stove being stoked and the sound of water being pulled. Dr. Hartwell arrived at 8:30 in the morning, wind burned from the ride and carrying a bag that had seen considerable use. He was a small, methodical man in his late 50s who examined Noah with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone who had been doing this long enough not to be rushed by anxious families, and who gave his assessment without cushioning it beyond what was medically accurate. The fever had been significant. The right course had been taken. The boy was out of immediate danger. He needed rest, fluids, no exertion, and he was to be watched for any return of symptoms over the next 48 hours. He asked who had managed the night. Caleb said Evelyn's name. The doctor looked at her with the appraising look of someone checking whether the description matched the reality. "Correct technique throughout," he said. "Whoever taught you knew what they were doing." "My grandmother," she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied, packed his bag, accepted coffee, gave additional instructions to Margaret, and left by 10. The house settled into a different kind of quiet after he'd gone, the quiet of aftermath rather than anticipation, the particular hush that follows a crisis that has resolved in the direction you prayed it would. Ruth came downstairs and was told, and cried briefly and efficiently, and then went up to sit with Noah. Daniel appeared and was told and went very still in a way that indicated he was managing something significant and intended to manage it privately. Henry had been up since the ice, and he sat at the kitchen table through the morning without much to say, which was not unusual for Henry, but the quality of the silence was different. And Noah slept. He slept through the morning and into the afternoon, properly this time, deeply. The good sleep of a body that has fought something hard and earned the rest. She checked on him twice. His forehead each time warm, but human warm, not that terrible heat of the night before. She was at his door the second time when she heard the footstep behind her. She turned. Caleb was in the hall. He had changed his clothes at some point. She hadn't seen when. And his face had the particular quality of a man who has slept for 2 or 3 hours after a long night and is running on something other than rest. He looked at Noah through the doorway. Then he looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." "You haven't yet." "I had a few hours." She hadn't, really. Maybe 40 minutes before she'd heard Noah in the hallway. But she was upright and functional, and there was still the day to get through. He was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, turning the brim the way he did when he was working through something. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "When you arrived," he said, I made assumptions about what you were here for." He paused. "I was fair enough to you in the way a man is fair when he's keeping his distance, but I wasn't. I didn't trust you. Not actually." "You'd known me for 2 weeks," she said. That's not what I'm trying to say." He stopped. Tried again, in the way of someone who doesn't do this often, and is doing it deliberately. "What you did last night, what you've been doing for this family since you got here. I wasn't ready to see it. I was looking for the angles that weren't there." She was tired enough that she didn't have the energy to manage her response the way she would have if she were more rested. So what came out was just honest. "I know," she said. "So did the town." "That's all right. I didn't come here expecting to be believed immediately." "That's a forgiving position." "It's a realistic one." She looked at her hands for a moment. "I knew what the situation looked like from the outside. I couldn't control what people assumed. The only thing I could control was what I actually did." He looked at her. "And what was that?" "The same thing I'll do tomorrow," she said. "Show up. Do the work." He stood with that for a moment. The hallway was quiet around them, the house still in its aftermath quiet. And outside through the window at the end of the hall, the afternoon light was thin and pale on the snow that had come again overnight. "All right," he said finally. And it was not a simple word. It was the sound of a man who had looked at something clearly, possibly for the first time, and acknowledged what he was seeing. He went downstairs. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer, looking in at Noah's sleeping face, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then she went to her room, lay down on top of the covers with her boots still on, and was asleep in under 2 minutes. She slept for 4 hours and woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Not alarming voices, not the clipped, urgent tones of the night before. These were ordinary voices, the kind that meant food was being made and people were moving through their regular business. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the light, which had gone the low amber of late afternoon, and to the feeling in her body, which was the specific exhaustion of someone who has run very hard and then stopped. She got up, straightened her dress, splashed water on her face from the basin, and went downstairs. The kitchen was full, not chaotically. It was just that several people had converged there at the same time, which in a house this size gave the room a warmth it didn't always have. Ruth was at the table doing something with a length of rope that appeared to be a more advanced version of the cat's cradle she'd been teaching Noah. Daniel was eating bread standing at the counter, which Margaret had told him not to do approximately 40 times, and Margaret was telling him again, not with particular heat, more like reflex. Henry was by the back door, coat half on, apparently about to leave for the barn. He stopped when Evelyn came in. "He woke up," Henry said, "about an hour ago. He ate some soup." She felt something loosen in her chest. "How did he seem?" "Like Noah." A pause. "He asked about thunder." "That's a good sign." Henry finished putting his coat on. He looked at her with an expression she'd come to understand as his version of saying something important. That particular steadiness in his face, the extra second before he moved. "What you did last night," he said. It was good. What you did." He went out through the back door before she could respond. She let him go. Henry said things once and didn't require confirmation that they'd been heard. She poured herself coffee and stood at the counter and drank it and felt the afternoon settle around her. Noah was sitting up in bed when she came to check on him. He looked diminished, smaller than usual, with the particular fragility that a fever leaves behind, the sense that the body has spent something significant and is working out how to recover it. But his eyes were clear, which was the thing she'd been waiting to see. The glassiness was gone. He tracked her when she came in with his usual alert attention, and he had something in his hands, the piece of string, because of course he did. It had apparently been retrieved from wherever he'd left it 2 nights ago. "Ruth says I was very sick," he said. "You were? How sick?" She sat on the edge of his bed. "Sick enough that we were all up most of the night watching you." He absorbed this. "Were you scared?" "Yes." He seemed to appreciate the honesty. "Pa was in my room," he said. "I remember that. I remember his voice. He talked to you most of the night." Noah looked at the string in his hands. "I couldn't always hear the words, but I could hear him." He paused. "That helped." "I thought it might." He was quiet for a moment, working the string. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him. He was looking at the string, not at her, with the carefully casual posture of someone asking a question they've been building toward for a while. "That's the plan," she said. "Even when things are hard?" "Things being hard is not a reason to leave," she said. "That's not how I operate." He nodded slowly, still looking at the string. "Good," he said. And then he held up the tangle in his hands and said, "I can't get the star right. Ruth keeps fixing it, but I keep making the same mistake." She took the string and found the error, which was the same error he'd been making since she'd first seen him work on it. The same crossing, in the wrong direction, always the same one. She corrected it and handed it back. "You always fix it the same place," she said. "Because I always make the mistake the same place." "Then that's the place to pay attention to." He thought about that with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Okay," he said. She checked his forehead, warm still, but a fever's end warm, not a fever's height warm, and told him to drink the rest of the water on his nightstand, and left him to his string. The change in the house came in the days after Noah's fever, and it came the way most real changes do. Not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small adjustments that together amounted to something new. Margaret was the most visible part of it. The morning after the fever broke, she came to Evelyn in the kitchen while they were making breakfast and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." Evelyn turned from the stove. "When my mother died," Margaret said, "I decided that nobody was going to come into this house and try to be what she was. I decided that before Papa ever wrote a single letter to anyone." She had her hands clasped in front of her and she was looking at Evelyn directly, the way she did everything, straight on, without deflection. "I wasn't fair to you, from the beginning." "You were honest," Evelyn said. "That's different from unfair." "I was both," Margaret said. I'm trying to say I was wrong about what I thought you were here to do." Evelyn set down the spoon she was holding. "What did you think I was here to do?" "Take." Margaret's jaw shifted. "Take his money, take the house, take the position, take up space that belonged to someone else." She paused. "You haven't taken anything. You've just added, quietly, without making a show of it." "I'm not here to take anything," Evelyn said. "I never was. I know that now." Margaret looked at her hands for a moment. "I'm not good at this. Saying things like this. You're doing fine. I want us to—" She stopped, started again. "I think we could work together properly, if you're willing." Evelyn looked at this young woman who had been running a house and raising siblings from the age of 15 and had done it without complaint and without anyone fully acknowledging the weight of it, who had held this family together through 4 years of grief with the force of sheer stubbornness, and who was now standing in her own kitchen trying to say something difficult because she'd decided it needed saying. "I'd like that," Evelyn said. "I'd like that very much." Margaret nodded. She picked up her spoon and went back to the porridge, and the conversation was over, and also something had started. The news of Noah's fever moved through the community the way news moved, faster than anyone sent it, slower in accuracy than anyone hoped. By the following week, the version circulating in Harlan's Crossing had been expanded considerably. It had Noah at death's door. It had Evelyn performing something that was described, depending on who was telling it, as either remarkable frontier medicine or something considerably less credible. Vera Hutchins appeared at the estate on a Tuesday, not with a baked item this time, but alone and in her everyday coat, which meant it was an actual visit and not a social performance. She sat in the parlor and drank her tea and said, "The town is talking about what happened." "I assumed it would be," Evelyn said. "The version I've heard most frequently gives you significantly more credit than you're probably comfortable with. People tend to expand a story when they retell it." "They do." Vera set down her cup. "But in this case, even the plain version is considerable." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "How much of it is true?" "I managed a fever through a night until the doctor could come. That's the accurate version." "And the fever was serious?" "Yes." "And you knew what to do?" "I knew enough to do something useful. That's different from knowing everything." Vera looked at her for a moment. "Agnes Morrow was in my parlor yesterday," she said. "She spent 45 minutes revising her opinion of you." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't graceful," Vera said. "Agnes doesn't do graceful when she's backing down from something, but she did it." A pause. "She's going to invite you to chair the Spring Fair Planning Committee." "I'm not sure I have time for that." "It's not really about the committee," Vera said. "It's about her publicly putting you in a position of responsibility. It's the closest she'll come to saying she was wrong." Evelyn thought about this. "Tell her I'll think about it." Vera smiled, and it was the real smile rather than the measuring one. "That's probably the right answer." After she left, Evelyn sat in the parlor for a while, listening to the house around her. Ruth and Clara were somewhere upstairs. She could hear the occasional burst of argument that meant they were working on something together. Daniel had been in and out all morning. The ranch outside was its usual working self, sounds of men and horses and machinery carried on the cold December air. She thought about the word Vera had used without apparently noticing its particular weight. You. Not Mrs. Carter, not Caleb Walker's wife. You, as though Evelyn's own name and presence in this community was becoming distinct from her arrival and what it had looked like from the outside. That was something. Metzit. Thomas left for Denver on a Thursday in January, 2 weeks after Noah had been fully recovered and declared by Dr. Hartwell to be in excellent health and no need of further concern. The leave-taking was managed with the imperfect, slightly awkward warmth of a family that was still learning how to show each other things. There was a breakfast, which Margaret made without being asked, and which included Thomas's preferred dish, biscuits with cream gravy, which he'd eaten since childhood, and which he'd stopped requesting somewhere in the last several years, and which appeared on the table that morning without commentary. He ate 2 helpings. Caleb was at the table for the entire meal, which he hadn't been for a regular breakfast in some time. He and Thomas talked about the ranch, about the logistics of correspondence, about what the engineering program would cover, and when Thomas expected to be home for the summer. They talked like 2 people who had practiced at conversation with each other but had gotten out of the habit and were getting back in, which was exactly what it was. When the wagon was loaded and the goodbyes had made their way through all 7 children, Noah's was longest, Daniel's was briefest, Ruth cried and did not want to be observed doing it. Evelyn shook Thomas's hand. He took her hand and then, somewhat surprising them both, held it a moment. "You changed things here," he said quietly. "I want you to know I see that." "Your family changed things," she said. "I just helped where I could. That's what I mean." He looked at her directly. "That's exactly what I mean." He climbed up into the wagon, and the wagon went down the lane, and Noah watched it until it was out of sight and then turned and went inside without saying anything, which was its own kind of growing up. Caleb stood on the porch for a moment after the wagon had gone. Evelyn stood beside him, not too close, not too far, in the cold morning air. "He'll be all right," she said. "I know he will." He didn't sound like he was entirely sure. "He's better than I was at his age. Braver." "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for." He looked at her sideways. "What makes you say that?" "You wrote the letters," she said. "When everything in you probably wanted to just close the door and keep the world out, you wrote the letters and you tried something new." She paused. That takes courage. A different kind than the kind that shows, but still. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside, it's cold." She followed him in. The weeks after Thomas's departure settled into the new pattern of the household, the one that had been building since Noah's fever, consolidating itself slowly into something that felt less provisional than what had come before. It was not without friction. Real life in a real house with real people was not without friction, and Evelyn was not the kind of person who pretended otherwise. Daniel went through a period of being difficult in the specific way of teenage boys who are testing every available surface to find out which ones hold. He was rude at the table one evening in a way that required Caleb to address it directly, and he was subsequently sullen for 3 days. And on the 4th day, he appeared in the kitchen while Evelyn was working and said, with the minimum syllables compatible with an apology, "I wasn't right the other night," and went back out. She told him she appreciated it and meant it. Clara finished the book she'd been reading and wanted to discuss it, and Evelyn had not read it, and they ended up in the parlor one evening with Evelyn listening to Clara describe the entire plot with editorial commentary, which was better than reading it would have been. Ruth, who had been warming toward Evelyn steadily since before the fever, declared one Saturday morning that she was going to teach Evelyn to ride. This was announced rather than proposed, and Evelyn had no particular resistance to it, and they spent 2 cold Saturday mornings in the corral with one of the gentler mares, while Ruth gave instruction with the authoritative patience of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had opinions about the correct method. Evelyn was not a natural rider. She said so plainly, which seemed to please Ruth, who had apparently expected more resistance to the fact. "You hold your shoulders wrong," Ruth said from the fence. "I know. And you look down. I'm aware. You have to look where you're going." "What I'm looking at," Evelyn said from the back of the mare, "is the ground I'd land on if I fell off." Ruth stared at her for a moment. Then she laughed. A real sudden laugh, unguarded. It was the first time Evelyn had heard her laugh like that. It changed her face completely. Henry appeared at the fence rail after the second lesson and watched without comment for a while, and then suggested a different adjustment to the way she was holding the reins. The adjustment helped. She didn't fall off either Saturday, which she considered a reasonable metric of success. The evening that changed things most clearly came on a Friday in late January. It was after supper, and the younger children had gone up, and Margaret was in the kitchen, and Daniel and Ruth were somewhere in the house being separately occupied. Evelyn was in the parlor mending, which had become her regular evening post. The chair by the fire, the basket of mending that a household of 9 people generated in impressive quantity, the lamp pulled close. Caleb came in. He came in the way he'd been coming into rooms she was in for the past several weeks, less like a man navigating around an obstacle, and more like a man coming into a room where he was comfortable. He sat in the armchair across from her and had a book, which he sometimes read in the evenings, and sometimes didn't read so much as held. Tonight, he didn't open it. "I had a letter from the land office today," he said. She looked up from the mending. "The Deacon parcel to the north," he said. "There's been a claim filed on it. Somebody's trying to register it as unclaimed territory." "Isn't it part of the estate?" "It is. Has been for 20 years. But the original deed has an error in the description. An old surveyor's mistake, never caught because nobody challenged it." He was turning the book in his hands. "If the claim goes through, we lose about 6,000 acres of the best winter grazing." "Who filed the claim?" He looked at her steadily. "The filing name is a land company, registered in Denver, but I know whose money is behind it." She waited. "William Lowe," he said. She sat with that for a moment. Marion Lowe's husband, the second largest landowner in the territory, the man who had a substantial reason to want the Walkers reduced. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" she asked. "I sent a wire today. There's a man in Ridgeville I've worked with before. He'll come out next week." He paused. "But there's a window on these claims. If it's not contested within 30 days of filing, it's significantly harder to challenge afterward." "When was it filed?" 11 days ago. 19 days left." She set down the mending. "The original deed," she said. "Where is it?" "In my study. Why?" "Because land office errors aren't always fatal to a claim," she said. "If you have continuous use documented, grazing records, boundary maintenance, tax records showing the acreage, that goes alongside the deed in a contest, It's not just the document, it's the history of occupation. She paused. My husband was in property law for several years. I learned things I didn't always want to know. Caleb looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. You know property law. I know enough. Not enough to replace your lawyer, but enough to be useful while you're waiting for him. He stood. He went to the study and came back with a wooden box, and he set it on the table between their chairs, and they spent the next 2 hours going through it. She found what she was looking for. Tax records going back 17 years, all showing the full acreage. Boundary maintenance records, sporadic but present. A hand-drawn map from 12 years ago, commissioned by Caleb himself, that showed the full extent of the north parcel clearly. That map, she said. Who drew it? A surveyor out of Cheyenne passed through and I hired him for a week. Is he still working? Last I knew. His testimony would be worth something, she said. A professional who physically walked the land and placed the boundary markers. That's not paperwork. That's a person. Caleb was watching her. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he was watching her work through the documents with an expression that was harder to interpret than his usual ones. What? She said. Nothing. A pause. I'm glad you're here. It was a plain sentence. It was not the first time he'd said something close to it, but it was the first time he'd said it without any particular context around it. Not, thank you for last night. Not, I appreciate what you did. Just the plain statement of a plain fact. She looked back at the documents. Let me write a summary of what we have before the lawyer comes, she said. It'll save time. You don't need to do that tonight. I'm not sleeping anyway. I'd rather be useful. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he got up and brought her paper and a pen from the study, and he sat back down with his book. And this time he opened it, and they stayed like that. Her writing and him reading and the fire burning down and the house quiet around them. Until well past midnight. The lawyer, a man named Aldous Crane, arrived from Ridgeville on the following Thursday. He was sharp and efficient, and initially addressed himself entirely to Caleb, which was not unusual for the time and place. He worked through the documents Caleb laid out for him with professional speed, making notes in the margins of his own pad, asking questions in the clipped way of someone who billed by the hour, even when the bill was not strictly by the hour. Then he reached the summary Evelyn had written. He stopped. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at Caleb. Who prepared this? My wife, Caleb said. Crane looked at Evelyn with a reassessment that was not quite surprise, more like recalibration. He was too professional for surprise. This is well organized, he said. The surveyor angle is correct and I would not have started there. Starting there saves us time. He flipped another page. The tax record argument in Section 3. That's the right framing. It's not just proof of payment, it's proof of consistent legal recognition of the boundary. That's what I thought, Evelyn said. He gave her one more measuring look, filed it away behind his professional expression, and went back to talking to both of them. They contested the Lowe claim. The surveyor came from Cheyenne, older now but thorough, and gave a deposition that was specific and unshakable. The tax records went to the land office alongside the deed and the surveyor's original maps. Aldous Crane, who had apparently decided that a client's wife who understood property law was an asset and not an anomaly, included her summary in the formal response without being asked. The claim was denied 6 weeks later. William Lowe did not challenge the denial. He was, as Vera Hutchins noted with quiet precision when she heard the result, not in a position to make a lot of noise about it given certain other questions that the investigation into his land company's registration documents had raised. Marion Lowe stopped coming to Walker Estate. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. The evening the letter from the land office arrived confirming the denial, Caleb read it at the supper table. He read it once, set it down, and looked around the table at his family. Ruth asked what it was. He told them briefly. Daniel said, "So Lowe tried to steal our land and got stopped. Essentially." Good. Daniel went back to his supper with the satisfaction of someone who had been wanting a clear good and bad outcome for a while and had finally gotten one. Noah, who had been listening carefully, looked at Evelyn. "Did you help with that?" "Your father did the work," she said. "I just helped organize the papers." But it mattered, Noah said. She looked at him. He said things like that sometimes, direct, without the cushioning that adults learn to put around observations, and the directness of them landed differently than the softened version would have. Yes, she said. I think it mattered. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back to his food. Caleb was looking at her from across the table. He had the letter in his hand still, and he was looking at her with that expression she'd been accumulating, the one that was past grateful and past respectful and was becoming something that she was beginning to let herself recognize carefully without looking at it too directly. Margaret passed the bread. Ruth argued with Daniel about something that had nothing to do with land claims. Claire was reading again, the book against the salt cellar, and this time no one told her to put it away. The table was loud and imperfect and incomplete. Thomas and Denver, one chair always slightly wrong. And it was also full. Actually full, not just occupied. Full of the noise and friction and warmth of people who were beginning, haltingly and without announcement, to be a family in the way that word actually meant, rather than the way it looked from a distance. Evelyn ate her supper and listened to all of it, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, undramatic, quietly extraordinary sensation of being in the right place. Not a perfect place, not a finished place, a right place, which was different and better, because right places you could actually live in. She passed the bread when it came to her, and answered Noah's next question, and let the evening go on around her, and didn't try to hold on to the moment. She just stayed in it. February came in hard. The snow that had been polite about itself through December and January finally committed in the first week of February, coming down for 3 days straight and leaving the ranch buried under 18 inches that turned the fence lines into suggestions and the road to town into something that required serious intent to navigate. The cattle were moved to the covered winter pasture. The ranch hands worked in shifts to keep the water troughs from freezing solid. The windmill needed attention twice in 4 days, and Henry and Caleb went out together in weather that had no business being worked in and came back with ice in their beards and got warm by the kitchen stove and went back out again. The house ran. That was what Evelyn noticed in those first hard February weeks. The way the house ran without anyone having to think too carefully about how to make it run. Meals appeared at the right times. The woodbox stayed filled because Daniel had taken that on without being asked, apparently deciding at some point that it was his job now and not requiring further discussion. Ruth managed the younger children's schoolwork with a competence that suggested she had a future in something requiring organization and patience. Clara kept the parlor in order, which was a small thing but had been nobody's job for 4 years and was now hers. Margaret had started letting Evelyn into the full management of the kitchen, not handing it over, but genuinely sharing it, which was different and harder and more real. They planned meals together on Sunday evenings, going through the week ahead, accounting for what was in the larder and what was running low and what would need to come from town when the road was passable again. These Sunday conversations had started as functional and had become gradually something else, longer, easier, wandering past the menu into other things. Margaret's opinions about the ranch, Evelyn's memories of Harrisburg in winter, the slow, unannounced business of two women learning each other. It was on one of these Sunday evenings, with the snow coming down outside and the kitchen warm from the stove, that Margaret said something that had clearly been sitting with her for a while. "Do you think you'll marry him?" Evelyn looked up from the list she was making. "Properly," Margaret said. "You're here. You've been here 3 months. But there hasn't been, the arrangement was never—" She stopped, which was unusual for Margaret. "I'm asking badly." "You're asking clearly enough," Evelyn said. "I just don't know the answer." "He hasn't said anything." "No. But I see how he looks at you now." Margaret turned her cup in her hands. "It's different than how he looked at you when you first came." "He didn't look at me much when I first came." "Exactly." Margaret paused. "He looks at you like he used to look at things he was trying to figure out how to keep." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking at the list. The handwriting on it was her own, the same hand that had written the summary for Aldous Crane, that had written 17 letters to a man she'd never met, that had written a final letter to her dead husband's creditors and signed away the last of what she'd had. The same hand in a different place. "I'm not going to assume anything," she said finally. "I've learned not to do that." "That's fair," Margaret said. She picked up her pen. What about the flour? Are we running low? Getting there. Add it to the list. And that was that, and they went back to the menu, and the snow came down outside, and neither of them brought it up again that evening. The conversation with Caleb happened on a Saturday afternoon in the third week of February, when the snow had stopped and the sky had gone the particular hard, bright blue that follows a long storm, and the world outside was blinding white under full sun. She had been in the garden, not the kitchen garden, Sam, that was under a foot of snow, and would stay that way until March. She had been in Eleanor's garden, the one on the west side of the house that had been left to go wild for 4 years. She'd been going there, occasionally, for the past month. Not to replant it, not in February, not yet, just to look at it, to understand what had been there and what was still there underneath the disorder. There were perennials that had survived the neglect, tough and determined, their dead stalks still marking where the beds had been. Rose canes that needed severe pruning, a lilac that had gone leggy but was not past saving. She was crouching near the far edge, brushing snow off a clump of something that might be peonies, when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. She knew it was him before she turned. She'd learned his footsteps the way you learned the sounds of a house, without trying to, just by being in it long enough. "I thought you were out with the cattle," she said. "Came back early." He stopped a few feet behind her, looking at the garden. "I haven't been back here in a long time." "I know." She stood, brushing the snow off her gloves. "I should have asked before I started coming here. It wasn't my—" "No," he said. "It's all right." She looked at the garden. The lilac was the tallest thing in it, its unpruned branches catching the light. In summer, she thought, with work, it could be something again. Not what it had been. She would never know exactly what it had been. But something. She planted all of it, Caleb said. Not like he was telling her a story. More like he was just letting the fact exist out loud. What was her favorite? He was quiet for a moment. The peonies. She said they were extravagant, and she didn't care. He paused. She was like that. She decided what she valued, and she didn't apologize for it. She sounds like she was a person worth knowing. She was. He said it simply, without the careful distance he'd had around the subject for the first months. She was difficult sometimes, and she was right about most things, and she loved these children without any apparent limit. She was the best person I've ever known. Evelyn looked at the place in the bed where the peonies were buried under the snow. "I know I can't be that," she said. "I'm not asking you to be. I know you're not. I'm just saying it plainly, because I think things need to be said plainly between us." He came a few steps closer and stood beside her, looking at the garden. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "What else needs to be said plainly?" She turned to look at him. "What do you want this to be?" He looked at her. The question had landed squarely and he didn't try to deflect it. "I want—" He stopped. He was a man who thought carefully before he spoke, and she gave him the time. "When you came here, I wanted practical. I wanted someone who could manage the house and be decent to my children. I thought that was the honest version of what I needed. And now? Now I think I was wrong about what I needed." He looked at the garden, at the lilac, at the snow. 3 months ago, I would have told you that what happened here was good enough. That the house running and the children settled and the work getting done, that was good enough. I'd made my peace with good enough. You're telling me you don't want good enough anymore. He looked back at her. I'm telling you that I don't think what you are is good enough. I think what you are is what this family needed. What I needed, specifically, and I was the last one to see it. He paused. Noah saw it first, which should probably embarrass me. She almost smiled. He's perceptive. He's 6. He shouldn't be more perceptive than his father. Children usually are, she said. They haven't learned yet to look away from what's in front of them. He was quiet for a moment. The sun was bright on the snow around them, and somewhere in the barn, a horse was moving, that familiar muffled sound coming across the cold air. She waited. She'd learned his silences. This one was not evasion. This was a man arranging something true into the right words. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the house needs managing and not because the children need you, though both of those things are real. I want you to stay because... He stopped, tried again. Because I come home now. Every evening I come home, and I mean that word differently than I've meant it in 4 years. There's a difference between returning to a place and coming home to one, and I don't think I'm wrong about what changed that." She looked at him in the full winter light. He was not a man who said things like that easily. She knew that. She'd watched him navigate around feeling for months, and the fact that he'd said it plainly, without elegance and without hedging, was its own kind of honesty. "I want to stay," she said. "I've wanted to stay since, I don't know when. Somewhere in the middle of it, when I stopped counting the days and just started living them." He looked at her. "I'm asking you to be my wife, not in the arrangement sense, the actual sense." She held his gaze. "I know the difference," she said. "Yes." He stood there for a moment, and she could see him absorbing it, the plain answer to the plain question, and something in his face settled, in the way that a man's face settles when a thing he has been bracing for turns out to be all right. He reached out and took her hand. Through both their gloves it was clumsy and imprecise, and neither of them mentioned it. They stood in Eleanor's garden in the February sun, and he held her hand, and neither of them said anything for a while. And that was enough. Though the wedding was small, and in March, when the snow was thinning and the mud was beginning, which was not the most picturesque time of year to get married, but was the time that made practical sense, and they were both practical people. It was in the front parlor of Walker Estate, which Evelyn and Margaret had spent 3 days making as presentable as it had ever been. The rugs beaten, the curtains freshly washed and hung, the windows cleaned until the afternoon light came through them clear and unobstructed. Margaret had put together a bouquet from the dried flowers she'd kept from the previous summer, arranged with the evergreen boughs that Clara and Noah had cut from the tree line behind the barn. And it was a strange and beautiful combination that nobody had planned for, and that worked anyway. The children were all there. Thomas had come back from Denver for it, arriving 2 days early on a train that had been delayed by lingering February weather, and showing up at the kitchen door still cold from the road, and Noah had launched himself at him with enough force to be a hazard, and Thomas had picked him up and not put him down for approximately 10 minutes. The judge who came from Ridgeville was a practical, white-haired man named Everett Cole, who had performed probably 200 weddings and had a way of conducting the ceremony that was direct and real rather than ornate. He said the necessary things. He didn't add unnecessary ones. When it was done, Margaret cried. She was briefly furious with herself about it, and then stopped being furious because there was no point. Noah said, "Now it's official," with the satisfaction of something properly completed, which made Thomas laugh. Daniel shook Caleb's hand with the stiff formality of a 16-year-old trying to behave like a man and mostly succeeding. Ruth put her arm through Evelyn's and stood beside her the way she'd stood beside her at Founder's Day, with the uncomplicated ease of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. Henry, who expressed most of his significant feelings through action rather than language, had repaired the gate on the kitchen garden that had been broken since November. He did it that morning, before the judge arrived, and he didn't say anything about it, and Evelyn didn't say anything about it either. But when she came around to that side of the house in the afternoon, she stood at the gate for a moment and ran her hand along the new hinge. Clara took her aside before supper and said with the directness that she apparently got from her father, "I'm glad you came. I wasn't at first, but I am now." "I know you weren't," Evelyn said. "Thank you for telling me." "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know that too." Clara appeared to consider whether this exchange was complete. She decided it was, and went back to help Margaret with the supper, and that was the entirety of it, and it was perfect in its way. What? Spring arrived the way it always did in that country, not gracefully, not all at once, but in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap, followed by mud, followed by the first real morning when you stepped outside and the air had a different quality to it, something alive in it that hadn't been there for months. The colt was born in March, as predicted. He was leggy and uncertain on his feet for the first day, and was then, with the confidence of healthy young horses, entirely sure of himself. Noah named him immediately, and with great conviction, Compass. Nobody asked why. The name stayed. Eleanor's garden was something Evelyn returned to in April, now with tools and intent rather than just observation. She did not try to restore it to what it had been. She hadn't known what it had been, and besides, replication wasn't the point. What she did was clear what needed clearing, preserve what was worth preserving, and add some things of her own. Plants she knew from her own history, things her grandmother had grown, varieties she'd wanted to try. The peonies came up in May. All of them. 6 clumps, robust and green, showing the first tight buds by the 3rd week of the month. She stood and looked at them for a while on the morning she found them and felt something she didn't try to name, just let it be there. She told Caleb that evening, and he came around to look, and he stood beside her and looked at the peonies for a long time. "She'd be glad they made it," he said. "I think so." He put his arm around her shoulders, which he'd been doing more lately. Small, casual contact, easy in a way that early contact between two careful people never was, which meant it had been earned rather than performed. "I think she'd be glad you're here," he said. "That might sound strange." "It doesn't," she said. She leaned into him slightly, and they looked at the peonies, and then went in for supper. There is something that people misunderstand about belonging. They tend to think it happens suddenly, that one day you're outside a thing, and the next day you're inside it, that there's a moment you can point to and say, "There, that's when it changed." But that's not how it works usually. Usually it happens the way water finds its level, slowly, without drama, filling the spaces that are available to it, until one day you realize it has been there long enough that the shape of it has become the shape of the container. Evelyn had lost a life before she came to Walker Estate. She had lost a husband, a home, a city she'd known for 30 years, a version of herself that had been built in and for that particular place. She had stood in the wreckage of it and made a practical decision, and she had gotten on a train, and she had arrived in a territory she'd never seen, to a family that didn't want her, to a house that was beautiful and broken in equal measure. And she had shown up every morning, to the kitchen, to the shelf, to the fever, to the garden, to the papers on the study floor at midnight. She had shown up and done what needed doing and not asked for credit for it, and not expected gratitude and not measured what she gave against what she received. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because she was not the kind of person who did less than that, and because somewhere in the middle of the cold and the hard work and the small daily acts of showing up, she had found something she hadn't come here looking for. She had found a life worth living inside. Not the one she'd had. She was 34 years old and she'd had a life and lost it, and she wasn't naive enough to pretend the new one was the same or better in some simple accounting sense. What she had was different, and she had learned to stop comparing different things as though they existed on the same scale. What she had was a kitchen that ran and a garden that was coming back, and a boy who showed her pieces of string, and a girl who had learned to share a room with another capable woman, and a young man on a train to Denver whose letters arrived every other week with a regularity that indicated he was doing what he'd set out to do. What she had was Henry's silences and Ruth's authority on the subject of horses, and Clara's opinions delivered without softening, and Daniel's grudging real improvement. What she had was a man who had learned late and imperfectly and with effort to let another person in. What she had was enough. More than enough. The kind of more than enough that you don't arrive at by having everything but by having the right things in the right proportion. It was Noah who said the thing that she would carry longest, on an evening in May when the windows were open and the air smelled like the lilac that had finally, after severe pruning and one full growing season of recovery, bloomed for the first time in 5 years. He was sitting with her on the back porch after supper. She was shelling peas, which was a mechanical enough job that she could do it and talk and look at the evening at the same time. He was doing what he usually did, which was being present with whatever he currently considered worth his attention. That evening, it was a piece of rose quartz he'd found near the creek. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you answered the letter." She looked at him. He was examining the quartz, turning it in the light. "Papa's letter. I'm glad you answered it." "How do you know about the letter?" "Margaret told me how it works, that Papa wrote to ladies and ladies could write back if they wanted to come." He turned the stone over. "You could have not answered it." "I could have." "But you did." "I did." He turned the stone one more time and then held it up so the last of the evening light came through it, pink and translucent, catching fire at the edges. "I think things work out the way they're supposed to sometimes," he said, with the calm confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be uncertain about the universe's basic intentions. "Not always, but sometimes." She looked at the quartz in his small hand, and at the light in it, and at the garden beyond the porch where the lilac was doing what it had finally had time to do. "I think so too," she said. "Sometimes." He put the stone in his pocket and picked up a handful of unshelled peas to help, and they sat together in the May evening, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch going about its end-of-day business. Horses settled, men's voices carrying from the bunkhouse, the windmill turning above the water tank, and she thought about the word home. She'd grown up in a home. She'd built a home. She'd lost a home. She'd arrived at what she thought was a solution to not having a home. And somewhere in the winter and the work and the fever and the garden and the long evenings with documents and the hand taken in an overgrown garden in February cold, she had come to understand that home was not a place you arrived at. It was a thing you built every day. Out of the ordinary materials available to you, the meals and the mending and the hard conversations and the grief you didn't try to fix but sat with anyway. Out of the decision made again every morning to be present in the life in front of you rather than the one behind you. She had made that decision in the dark on a train heading west with $42 and a letter in her coat pocket. She had made it again every morning since. She would make it again tomorrow. That was the truth of it, as she understood it now. The stories people told about belonging and love and finding your place in the world made it sound like a destination, a thing you traveled toward and arrived at and could then stop moving toward. But that wasn't what it was. It was a practice, a daily, imperfect, often unglamorous practice of choosing the life you were in over the life you wished you had, or the life you'd lost, or the life you were afraid you wouldn't deserve. She had chosen this life. She chose it again. The evening went quiet around her. Inside the house, she heard Margaret's voice, and then Clara's, and then the sound of Caleb coming through the back door. She knew his footstep without looking, and he came out onto the porch and stopped beside her chair. "Supper cleaned up?" she asked. "Ruth and Daniel are finishing." He looked at Noah. "Shouldn't you be thinking about bed?" "Not yet," Noah said with complete serenity. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She kept her face neutral. He let it go. He pulled the other porch chair close to hers and sat. And he looked out at the evening, and she looked out at the evening, and Noah sat between them examining his rose quartz, and the lilac moved in the last of the light, and the ranch went about its end-of-day business around them. It was not a perfect moment. There was a fence on the north pasture that needed repair. There was a letter that needed writing to Thomas. The road into town was soft from spring rains and was going to need attention before it became impassable. Caleb had a disagreement with one of his senior hands that hadn't been resolved. Evelyn had a headache starting behind her left eye that she'd been ignoring since mid-afternoon. None of that made this moment less. It was just the texture of a real life, the roughness that made the good parts of it actual rather than imagined. The woman who had arrived with $42 and a carpet bag and no certain expectation of welcome sat on the back porch of Walker Estate in the May evening and watched the light go out of the sky, and she was home. Not because she had been accepted, not because she had been lucky, but because she had shown up again and again in the cold and the uncertainty and the unglamorous middle of things, and had done what needed doing and had stayed. That was all it had ever taken, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything.